Hey, 7-8. We're back, and we're going to move on to our next unit, which is about the Roaring Twenties, also sometimes called the Jazz Age, the nickname for this time period, the start of America as we know it. So the 1920s are really interesting, and they really changed the way American lifestyle is, and that's what this video is mainly going to be about. And you guys are going to have some choices about what you'd like to study in our look at the 1920s. This is the first one, consumerism and the modern lifestyle. So, mass production in World War I. You guys know, because all year we've been studying industrialization and the use of new machines to make huge factories, that in World War I they used those factories to produce cannons and exploding shells and guns and uniforms and the other things they needed. And there was a lot of fear in Europe and in America that after the end of the war, those factories would close down and it would cause an economic downturn. Factories would close, people would lose jobs. There's a lot of concern over that. But that's not what ended up happening at all. Those companies that were producing military goods invented new appliances and conveniences that became standard in the American home. So things like refrigerators, the vacuum cleaner comes on the scene in the 1920s, the toaster oven. Here you see an electric stand mixer, and this thing over on the side here, this is actually a washing machine. This is an old-fashioned washing machine. They didn't really have dryers at this point, but there's a spinning tub in here like your washing machine. And then this roller system on top was used to dry the clothes out. So you'd put the wet laundry through the rollers once or even twice to squeeze out the water, and then it would dry more quickly than if you just hung up sopping wet laundry. You also see the telephone, the old-fashioned candlestick telephone on the bottom there. Telephones did not become standard in the American home in the 20s. Upper-class folks, especially in big cities, had telephones, but they did not become a normal part of American life, the same way that a toaster, a vacuum cleaner, washing machine, or refrigerator did. One of the big things about these massive new consumer products is that everybody wanted them. Everybody wanted a refrigerator because it's so convenient to have a refrigerator in your home versus an ice box where you had to pay an iceman to deliver ice every week. Because of the conveniences, everybody wanted these new things, and the way to get them was to buy on credit, to borrow money. They didn't have credit cards like we do today, but there are multiple ways that you could get a credit account with a store, pay a little bit now and pay a little over time, or put it on layaway, which is where you pay the store to keep it so that they don't sell it to somebody else, but you don't get it until you pay your last payment. And so those were standard ways that people started to borrow money to get these modern conveniences. This explosion in consumer credit really never goes away. People still have consumer credit today. You'd be hard-pressed to find an adult who didn't have a credit card that they used to borrow money to buy things. Okay, in terms of specific inventions that change America, the home radio explodes into American culture. Here you see some folks with a very early model home radio. These boys where each one has a speaker up to their ear. And then on the left, the family radio. Radios totally change American culture, and they change it to be much more like our culture today because it is a mass form of media. With radios, you can broadcast music, live news, and sports. Before the radio, there were no live sports. Reading a report of who scored afterwards in the newspaper is so much more boring than hearing it live. And baseball, America's favorite sport at the time, is a sport that is so good on radio. New forms of music, news. Here you can see the Vermont-born Calvin Coolidge, the President of the United States for part of the 20s, and he is the first president who broadcast himself on radio. Music, country music, and the Grand Ole Opry, and jazz became popular on the radio. And of course, news. If there was a major news event, for example, when one of the presidents in the 1920s died of a heart attack, everyone around the country could know almost instantly because many, many people had a radio. News could get out so much more quickly. You see I've got a Wheaties box in the bottom here, the Breakfast of Champions. Wheaties is one of the products that really makes a lot of money off radio. They do a couple innovative things that no one had ever done before. One is they're sponsoring radio shows. So many radio shows would have a sponsor. The same way when you watch a YouTube show today, they say, oh, this episode is sponsored by. Also, Wheaties was a pioneer by using new advertising systems. They had a jingle. They wrote a song to advertise Wheaties, and it was the first time any company had ever done that before. And Wheaties became the best-selling breakfast cereal in America. The advertising must have been great because Wheaties is kind of gross. You see, I also have the logos for the TV channels ABC, NBC, and CBS up in the top. Those broadcasting companies started as radio companies, and they are still major media companies today. One last note about radio's impact. It created a new type of celebrity. Babe Ruth, the baseball player we see on the bottom left, he became famous all across the country because of how good he was at the sport. Whereas beforehand, even in a big stadium, maybe 30 or 50,000 people can see him. But now, people all around the country could hear how well he would hit in a World Series game. Music stars. Before this, there were records, yeah, but records and record players were expensive. With radio, one music star could do one show on the radio, and people all over the country could hear them. Radios were great for disseminating information, but also just for teenagers who wanted to get in on music culture and things like that. It would be a big deal for you to be able to hear your favorite music star on the radio without having to pay for a new record every time a new record came out. That was a really big deal, the same way that a kid today might really want to have a cell phone or really want to have access to the internet in their home. Having a radio in your home gave you access to the culture in a way that kids never had before in all of human history. One other big change is Ford's Model T. We talked about this earlier in the year, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but here on the right we see Henry Ford standing in front of a Model T, and on the left, one example of a Model T. They made different types of Model Ts at different times, so sometimes the back and the cab looked a little different, but they were always painted black because black paint was cheap. Henry Ford famously said, "You can have any color you want as long as it's black." By the end of the 20s, about half of American homes had a car, and the Model T was the most popular by far. The Model T was very hardy. It was surprisingly a tough car. If you see on the left here a Model T going off-road, only about 2% of American roads were drivable like a modern road. And you can see on the right, Buster Keaton, a slapstick actor, driving a car that collapses as he hits a bump. Bumps were common, but the cars really did pretty well. We'll talk a little bit more about cinema, but radio was much more influential because all movies at this time were silent movies. So to recap the main points, new technology in the 1920s led to lifestyles more similar to how we live today. Appliances made life easier for people, but a lot of families borrowed money. And by the end of the decade, more than 50% of families had a car or a radio. I'm not sure if that's clear, but more than 50% of families had a car, and more than 50% of families had a radio. The radio especially led to a more united culture in America around sports, music, and celebrities that really changed the way American culture worked and functioned. So we'll talk a little bit more about this and some of the other important points in the 1920s. It's important to remember just basically that the 1920s were, in many ways, at least for white Americans, a much more comfortable time than. And we'll talk more about some of these different ideas coming up. So thanks a lot, guys. I hope everybody's doing real well. Take care.